It was a sunny Thursday afternoon in downtown Chicago, and the sidewalks were bustling with people going about their business. The air was filled with the chatter of shoppers, the sound of honking cars, and the occasional hum of street musicians playing for spare change. In the midst of it all, John Miller sat in his patrol car, lazily watching the crowds with a mix of boredom and annoyance. John was a cop who had been on the force for over 15 years. He was the kind of officer who prided himself on keeping the streets clean, but had earned a reputation for being overly aggressive, especially toward minorities. Today was no different. As he sipped his lukewarm coffee, he couldn't help but feel like his shift was dragging. That's when his radio crackled to life. "All units, we've got a report of a possible shoplifter at Lux Fashion on Michigan Avenue," the dispatcher announced. Suspect is described as an older black male, wearing a dark suit and hat. John's eyes lit up at the description. He straightened in his seat, tossing his coffee cup into the passenger seat. Finally, something to break up the monotony, he muttered under his breath. With a smirk, he turned on his sirens and sped down the street, weaving through traffic with an eagerness that bordered on excitement. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Samuel Thompson was exiting the upscale clothing store, carrying a small, neatly wrapped package. At 68 years old, Samuel moved with a grace that defied his age. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and his polished shoes reflected the bright afternoon sun. He had spent a quiet hour inside the store, carefully selecting a gift for his granddaughter's graduation. He was looking forward to surprising her with the watch she had been eyeing for months. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, Samuel adjusted his hat and began making his way down the busy street, blending seamlessly into the flow of people. He had no idea that a pair of suspicious eyes was already locked onto him. John Miller pulled up to the curb, his police car screeching to a halt. He jumped out, slamming the door behind him, and made a beeline toward Samuel. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" John barked, his voice slicing through the crowd. People turned to see what the commotion was about, some pulling out their phones to record. Samuel stopped in his tracks, confused by the sudden command. He turned slowly, meeting John's gaze with a calm, questioning look. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked politely, though he could already sense the tension in the air. "I got a report of a shoplifter matching your description," John snapped, eyeing the package in Samuel's hand. "What's in the bag?" Samuel frowned, his confusion deepening. "This," he held up the small bag. "It's a gift for my granddaughter. I just bought it." John wasn't buying it. "Yeah, sure you did," he said with a sneer. "Why don't you go ahead and show me the receipt?" Samuel hesitated for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket. The crowd that had gathered around was now watching intently, some whispering among themselves. Samuel's hands were steady as he pulled out the receipt, but John's suspicion only seemed to grow. He grabbed the slip of paper, barely glancing at it before crumpling it up. "Doesn't prove anything," John said dismissively. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall." A wave of humiliation washed over Samuel, but he complied without protest. As he turned to face the brick wall, he could feel the eyes of strangers boring into him, their phones raised like weapons. The sound of John snapping on a pair of latex gloves echoed in his ears, followed by the rough pat-down that came next. "You have no right to do this," Samuel said quietly, trying to maintain his composure. But John was already too caught up in his own authority trip to listen. "Save it for the judge. John replied coldly as he patted down Samuel's pockets. Finding nothing suspicious, his frustration grew. "What are you hiding, old man?" "Nothing," Samuel replied, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm just an old man trying to buy a gift for his granddaughter." The words hung in the air, but they did nothing to sway John. He was determined to make an example of Samuel, to prove that he had caught another criminal in the act. The humiliation Samuel felt was almost unbearable, but he refused to let it show. He stood tall, even as John's rough hands searched him again, this time almost vindicatively. When the search turned up nothing, John's irritation reached a boiling point. He grabbed Samuel by the arm, twisting it behind his back. "You're coming with me," he said through gritted teeth. "But I haven't done anything wrong," Samuel protested, the first hint of anger creeping into his voice. "You will have your chance to explain yourself at the station," John replied. Without another word, he shoved Samuel toward the police car. The crowd gasped as Samuel was forced into the back seat, still maintaining a dignified silence. The door slammed shut, and John climbed into the front, revving the engine with a look of satisfaction. As the car sped off, Samuel stared out the window, a million thoughts racing through his mind. He wondered how things had escalated so quickly, how a simple shopping trip had turned into this nightmare. But one thing was certain: this was far from over. The ride to the police station was tense. Samuel sat in the back seat, his hands cupped behind him, staring out the window as Chicago's bustling streets whizzed by. The flashing lights of the police car reflected off the buildings, but Samuel's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't believe that this was happening. Decades of hard work, integrity, and respect, and it had all come to this moment of public humiliation because of one man's blind prejudice. In the front seat, John Miller was riding high on his adrenaline rush, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Samuel, the older man's calm demeanor only fueling John's frustration. How could someone accused of theft act so composed? To John, it was just another sign of arrogance. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, John radioed his colleagues, announcing his arrival with an air of triumph. "Got a suspect here, possible thief," he barked into the mic, not bothering to hide the smugness in his tone. When they came to a stop, John practically leapt out of the car, yanking the back door open and pulling Samuel out. "Watch your step, old man," John sneered as he led Samuel through the entrance, where the harsh fluorescent lights of the station made everything look sterile and unwelcoming. A few officers glanced up from their desks, curious about the commotion. Most of them were used to John's heavy-handed tactics, but had long since stopped questioning his methods. "Book him," John called out to Officer Carter, a younger officer behind the front desk. "Caught him red-handed at Lux Fashion. Old guy thought he could walk out with some expensive merchandise." Carter looked at Samuel, who stood with an air of quiet dignity despite his disheveled appearance. The young officer hesitated. "Did you find anything on him?" he asked tentatively, knowing John's reputation. John's face tightened. "Just process him, okay?" he snapped, clearly not in the mood to be questioned. He shoved the shopping bag into Carter's hands. "Check this. There's probably something he's hiding." As Samuel was escorted to a holding cell, the whispers among the officers grew louder. Most of them were curious about who this elderly man was and why John was so determined to pin something on him. But none of them dared to confront John directly. He was known for holding grudges. Samuel, now behind bars, sat on the cold, hard bench. The cell was cramped and dimly lit, with an unpleasant smell lingering in the air. Despite everything, he remained calm, his mind focused on how to resolve the situation without escalating it further. He was well aware that one wrong move or word could make things worse, especially with someone like John Miller. Meanwhile, back in the main area, Officer Carter had started to go through the contents of the shopping bag. As he pulled out the meticulously wrapped gift box and the store receipt, he couldn't help but notice the precision and care with which it had been packaged. Frowning, he cross-checked the receipt details with the items inside. It all seemed legitimate. The watch was not stolen. It had been paid for in full. Carter walked over to John, who was leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. John, this all checks out," Carter said, holding up the receipt. "It's legit. He bought the watch. There's nothing here to suggest he stole anything." John's face turned a shade darker. "That can't be right," he muttered under his breath. "There's no way he's clean." Refusing to accept it, he snatched the receipt from Carter and scanned it himself. But there it was, clear as day, the time-stamped proof of purchase. Before John could react further, the station door swung open with a loud creak. Two men in dark suits, badges clipped to their belts, walked in with a sense of purpose. They exchanged a few words with a senior officer before making their way toward John. "Officer Miller, we need to speak with you," said the taller of the two men. He had a sharp, commanding presence that immediately drew everyone's attention. The room went quiet as the officers realized that these men were not from their precinct. The emblems on their badges revealed their affiliation, the FBI. John's heart skipped a beat. "What's this about?" he asked, his confidence wavering for the first time. The agent gave him a cold, scrutinizing look. "The man you just brought in, Samuel Thompson? Do you have any idea who he is?" John shrugged dismissively. "Yeah, he's a shoplifter. Probably thought his age would let him get away with it." The FBI agent's eyes narrowed. "You couldn't be more wrong, Officer Miller. Samuel Thompson is the newly appointed director of the FBI." A stunned silence fell over the room. Every officer froze in place, their jaws dropping as they processed the information. John's face turned ashen, the color draining away as if he'd seen a ghost. What did you just say?" he stammered, his bravado evaporating. The agent stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "The man you just humiliated, cuffed, and locked up without cause is your new boss, Officer Miller. And trust me, he's not going to forget what you did today." John's mind was racing. Panic set in as he realized the enormity of his mistake. All those years of pushing his weight around, of bending the rules because he thought he could, none of it had prepared him for the storm that was about to hit. He had just humiliated the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country. In the holding cell, Samuel remained seated, his expression unchanged as the officers scrambled outside. He had overheard enough to understand that the tables had turned. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. For years, he had worked behind the scenes, overseeing cases of misconduct, corruption, and prejudice within the ranks of law enforcement. Now, he was experiencing firsthand the abuse he had fought so hard to eliminate. He took a deep breath, calming the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He knew what he had to do next. But first, he would let the fear sink in for Officer Miller. It was time for John to learn a lesson he would never forget. The station was in chaos. Whispers spread like wildfire as officers and staff processed the news. The elderly man John Miller had roughly arrested was none other than Samuel Thompson, the newly appointed FBI director. The atmosphere that had been charged with tension just moments ago now hung thick with dread. John stood frozen in place. Disbelief etched across his face. The words kept echoing in his mind. Your new boss? How could this be? His eyes darted toward Samuel's holding cell. The realization of what he'd done sank in, bringing with it a wave of nausea. His arrogance had landed him in a situation he couldn't simply bully his way out of. Meanwhile, Samuel sat quietly in the cold, dimly lit cell, his expression calm despite the turmoil outside. He could hear the commotion beyond the bars, the frantic voices, the hurried footsteps. Samuel had spent decades dealing with law enforcement agencies across the country. He knew the power of reputation and respect, or lack thereof. But today, he had chosen to let the system reveal its own flaws. Now, the tables had turned. In the hallway, the two FBI agents who had stormed into the station were giving orders. Get him out of that cell immediately. One of them commanded with an air of authority that silenced any protests. A group of officers scrambled to comply, fumbling with the keys. As the cell door swung open, Samuel slowly stood up, taking his time. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew every eye in the room was now on him. Every whisper ceased, replaced with a palpable tension. The officers had been quick to dismiss him when they thought he was just another old black man in shabby clothes. Now, they couldn't meet his gaze. The lead FBI agent, Agent Roberts, extended his hand. Director Thompson, we deeply apologize for this gross misconduct. There was genuine remorse in his voice, but Samuel was not interested in apologies. Samuel nodded curtly, not bothering to shake the offered hand. I'll deal with this later, he said, his tone calm but firm. Right now, I have business to attend to. As he stepped out of the cell, John Miller was standing just a few feet away, his once arrogant demeanor completely shattered. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, his confidence draining with every step Samuel took toward him. Director Thompson, I had no idea, John stammered, his voice breaking. For the first time in his career, he was at a complete loss for words. The power dynamics had shifted so abruptly that he could hardly process it. Samuel's gaze was steady, piercing through John's flimsy excuses. No, you didn't know who I was, but you knew exactly what you were doing, Samuel replied, his voice even and composed. You saw an elderly black man and assumed I was beneath you. You didn't think I deserved basic respect or decency. John opened his mouth to protest, but Samuel held up a hand to silence him. Spare me your excuses, he continued. You made your decision based on your own biases. Now, you'll face the consequences of those choices. As the room grew silent, the weight of Samuel's words hung in the air like a judge's gavel. The officers who had watched John swagger through the precinct for years were now witnessing his public humiliation, and no one dared to intervene. Agent Roberts cleared his throat, attempting to break the tension. Director Thompson, would you like us to handle this internally, or do you want to press formal charges? Samuel took a deep breath. Part of him was tempted to see John prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But he knew that if he pressed charges, it would drag out into a lengthy legal battle that might overshadow his real work. Besides, He had other ways to ensure that John faced the repercussions of his actions. "No," Samuel said finally. "No formal charges for now. But rest assured, Officer Miller's record will be thoroughly reviewed, along with this entire precinct." He turned to John, who looked as if he might collapse under the weight of his shame. "You're not going to get away with this. I promise you that." With that, Samuel turned to leave, the two FBI agents flanking him like bodyguards. As he made his way through the station, every officer he passed stood at attention, their faces a mix of awe, fear, and respect. Samuel was well aware that his presence would be a wake-up call for many of them. Stepping out into the cool Chicago air, Samuel felt the weight of the past few hours slowly lift from his shoulders. But he knew this wasn't over. The rot within the system ran deep, and it would take more than exposing a single corrupt cop to fix it. The FBI agents escorted him to a black SUV waiting at the curb. Before getting in, Samuel turned to Agent Roberts. "I want a full report on Officer Miller's history," he ordered. "I suspect this isn't the first time he's abused his power." Roberts nodded. "We'll get on it right away, sir." As the car pulled away from the station, Samuel allowed himself a moment of reflection. Today had been a battle won, but the war was far from over. For every John Miller, there were countless others who operated with impunity, believing they were above the law. But as long as Samuel held his position, he would make sure that no one, not even those in uniform, would be safe from accountability. In the back seat, Samuel pulled out his phone. He had a long list of calls to make, starting with the mayor's office. If the city's police force thought today was the end of it, they were sorely mistaken. The wheels of justice had just begun to turn, and Samuel intended to make sure they would crush anyone who stood in the way of change. As the news spread, the entire police department was thrown into chaos. Phones rang off the hook, reporters camped outside the station, and social media was flooded with videos of Samuel Thompson's humiliating arrest. Within hours, the incident had gone viral, and the public outrage was mounting. John Miller sat in his office, his hands shaking as he scrolled through his phone. Every news outlet had picked up the story, each one highlighting his name and actions. His face was plastered all over the internet, labeled as a racist cop who had wrongly arrested the FBI director. John had never imagined that his careless actions would come back to haunt him like this. A knock on his door pulled him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was Chief O'Connor, a stout, graying man who had served in the force for over 3 decades. The chief's usually stern face was now drawn with worry lines. "John, we've got a problem," O'Connor began without preamble as he closed the door behind him. "The mayor is on my back, and there are talks of an internal investigation. The city council is furious. They're demanding answers, and I've got the FBI breathing down my neck." John swallowed hard. "Chief, I didn't know who he was. He was just another suspect acting suspiciously." O'Connor cut him off, his voice rising in frustration. "That's exactly the problem, John. You didn't know who he was, and you didn't bother to find out before treating him like a criminal. The FBI is out for blood, and they have every right to be." There was a tense silence as John tried to process the gravity of the situation. He had always been able to brush off complaints and accusations in the past. But this time, the stakes were different. Samuel Thompson was not just anyone. He had the power and influence to ruin John's career, and it seemed like he was going to use it. "What do we do now?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. O'Connor sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Damage control, for starters. We need to issue a public apology. You'll have to go on record, admit your mistake, and take full responsibility. Maybe, just maybe, it'll calm things down enough for the heat to die down." The thought of publicly admitting he was wrong made John's stomach churn, but he nodded reluctantly. At this point, he had no choice. "Fine, I'll do it," he muttered, bitterness lacing his words. Meanwhile, across town, Samuel Thompson sat in his sleek office at the FBI headquarters. The room was a blend of modern and minimalist decor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city below. Despite the chaos he had just endured, he appeared calm and composed. But beneath his measured exterior, his mind was racing with thoughts of how to turn this incident into an opportunity. The door opened and his deputy, Agent Karen Mitchell, walked in with a stack of reports. "Sir, we received dozens of calls from civil rights organizations and community leaders offering their support. It seems like this incident struck a nerve," she said, placing the papers on his desk. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Let's use this momentum to push for reforms. I've been wanting to address the systemic issues in this city's police department for a while. This might be the catalyst we need." Karen raised an eyebrow. "You really want to go after the Chicago PD? That's going to stir up a lot of resistance, especially from the unions." Samuel leaned back in his chair, a determined look in his eyes. "Let them resist. It's about time someone held them accountable. We'll start with a full investigation into Officer Miller's record. Something tells me this isn't the first time he's abused his power." Karen gave a slight nod of agreement. "I'll get a team on it right away. In the meantime, the media is eager for a statement from you. How do you want to handle it?" Samuel paused, considering his options. "I'll make a statement," he said finally, "but it won't be just about me. I want to address the bigger picture. The need for accountability, transparency, and change in policing." Karen smiled slightly, impressed by Samuel's resolve. "I'll arrange a press conference for tomorrow morning." The next day, the media frenzy reached its peak. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and reporters shouted questions as Samuel Thompson approached the podium outside FBI headquarters. Dressed in a sharp suit, he looked every bit the leader that he was. "Thank you all for being here today," Samuel began, his voice steady and commanding. "Yesterday's incident was a stark reminder of the challenges we still face in this country. I was treated unfairly because of assumptions made about my appearance. But this isn't just about me. It's about every individual who has been unjustly profiled, mistreated, or ignored because of the color of their skin." The crowd quieted, hanging on to every word he said. "I could use my position to seek personal retribution," he continued. "But instead, I choose to focus on the real issue, the need for reform within our law enforcement agencies. We will be conducting a thorough investigation, not only into the actions of Officer Miller, but also into the broader practices of the Chicago Police Department." The reporters erupted with more questions, but Samuel held up his hand for silence. "I believe in justice, not revenge. But let me be clear, those who abuse their power will be held accountable. This is just the beginning." As Samuel stepped away from the podium, the applause was deafening. His words had struck a chord, not just with the press, but with the public at large. He knew that he had turned the tables. The humiliation he had endured was now a weapon in his arsenal, and he intended to wield it to bring about real change. Back at the precinct, John Miller watched the press conference in disbelief. Each word from Samuel felt like a nail in the coffin of his career. The investigation was no longer just about one bad arrest. It was expanding into something much larger. And John realized with dread that he was at the center of it all. The fallout was only beginning. And as the tide of public opinion turned against him, John knew he was running out of time to save what little was left of his reputation. The next few days were a blur for John Miller. What had started as a routine stop in a luxury store had spiraled out of control, and now he found himself at the center of a media storm. News outlets were calling for his resignation, and the pressure from his superiors was mounting. Every time he opened his email, there was a new message demanding an explanation or providing another threat to his career. John sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. The news channels were all covering the same thing. Samuel Thompson, the head of the FBI, had turned the tables on him, publicly condemning his actions. The footage of his humiliation had been replayed endlessly, and it was all anyone was talking about. The public, too, was in an uproar. Protesters gathered outside police stations, holding signs demanding justice, and social media was flooded with calls for accountability. He didn't know what to do next. His wife, Lisa, entered the room, holding a cup of coffee. She set it down gently in front of him, her face filled with concern. "John, you need to say something. The longer you stay silent, the worse it's going to get. You've got to take responsibility for what happened." John rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the situation. "I didn't know it was him, Lisa. I didn't know he was the head of the FBI. But I know I made a huge mistake. I treated him like a criminal, and now I'm paying the price for it." Lisa sat down beside him, her voice soft but firm. "It's not just about the job, John. It's about who you are. You have to look at what you did, understand why it was wrong, and then figure out how to make it right. You've always said you wanted to make a difference in this world, but this is the moment where you prove it." John looked at her, his eyes tired and heavy with regret. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the law. But now, it felt like he had failed not only as a police officer, but as a person. Meanwhile, Samuel Thompson sat in his office, reviewing the latest developments. His press conference had gone viral, and while the support had been overwhelming, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The backlash against John Miller had been swift, but Samuel wasn't focused on that. He was focused on the bigger picture. The real work was about exposing the systemic issues within the police force, the racism, the corruption, the abuse of power. And to do that, he needed allies. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Karen, it's Samuel. I want you to start pulling every record you can find on Miller. His history, complaints, anything that could help us make our case. We're going after the whole department. But Miller is ground zero." Karen Mitchell, his trusted assistant director, responded immediately. "Understood, sir. I'll have a team working on it right away." Samuel leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. He knew that taking down a single officer wasn't enough. He needed to go after the entire system. And as much as he hated using the situation for political gain, he knew this was the perfect moment to strike. Back at the police department, John was called into a meeting with his supervisor, Captain Lawson. The captain's office was stuffy, the air thick with tension as John sat down across from him. Lawson didn't mince words. "John, this is bad. Really bad. The mayor is threatening to suspend you, and the department is under intense scrutiny. You've embarrassed the entire force. But more than that, you've put us in a position where we have to answer to the FBI. John looked down at his hands, his stomach churning. I know, Captain. I screwed up, and I'll take full responsibility for it. But I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Lawson sighed, rubbing his forehead. The problem is, it's not just about what you knew or didn't know. It's about how you handled it. You need to publicly apologize, take some responsibility, and hope this blows over. The department can't afford any more bad press. John nodded, but a part of him resisted. The thought of publicly apologizing, of admitting to his mistake in front of the world, made his skin crawl. But deep down, he knew it was the only option he had left. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line. As he left the office, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. He had never felt more alone. The next day, John made his public apology. He stood in front of a camera, his face pale and his voice shaky. The words were hard to get out, but he knew they were necessary. I made a grave mistake, John said, his voice cracking. I wrongfully detained and humiliated a man who did not deserve it. I was wrong to treat him the way I did. I apologize to Mr. Samuel Thompson, to his family, and to anyone who has been affected by my actions. I take full responsibility for what happened. The statement felt empty, almost hollow, but it was all he could offer. As he finished, the reporters in the room didn't ask any more questions. They had heard enough. The damage was done. Later that night, as John sat in his living room, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his old friend and former partner, Detective James Crawford. You're not done yet, John. You think a simple apology is going to fix this? No. Samuel Thompson's out for blood. He won't stop until he's taken you down. John stared at the message, feeling a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had thought that by apologizing, he could somehow put this all behind him. But now, it felt like he was only getting started. Samuel Thompson was coming for him, and he didn't know if there was anything he could do to stop it. The storm was far from over. John Miller spent the next few days lying low. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down, and he could barely escape the barrage of news reports. It seemed like every channel had something to say about the infamous incident at the luxury store. His face was plastered all over the internet and on TV screens. The more he saw, the more he regretted what had happened. One evening, as he sat alone in his living room, trying to find some semblance of peace, the doorbell rang. John didn't want to answer it. He knew it was probably another reporter or someone from the department with more bad news. But when the ringing didn't stop, he reluctantly got up. He opened the door to find his former partner, Detective James Crawford, standing there. Crawford looked tired, his eyes dark with concern, but he still had a calm demeanor. "John, can we talk?" James asked, stepping inside when John stepped back to allow him in. John didn't say anything at first. He motioned for James to sit down. The air between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. James sat across from him, his expression serious. "I know you're going through hell right now," James began, "but you need to understand that it's not over. It's just starting." John lowered his gaze, his hands trembling. "I thought if I apologized, everything would go away, but it's only getting worse. I've become the face of everything that's wrong with the system. James sighed, leaning forward. That's the thing, John. You weren't just an officer who made a mistake. You were a symbol. You became the embodiment of the problem. And that's exactly what they want, the public, the media. They want someone to blame. But you have to understand, it's not just you. It's everything you represent as a cop. John looked up at James, his frustration growing. So what now? Am I just supposed to sit here and wait for them to destroy me? James shook his head. You need to fight back, John. You can't just hide in a corner and hope it blows over. You made a mistake, but it's not the end of the world. You still have a chance to make it right, to be part of the solution, but you have to own up to it fully. Don't just apologize, take action. John ran a hand through his hair. I don't know how, James. What can I possibly do? How can I undo everything that's happened? James stood up, pacing across the room as he spoke. It starts with owning your part in this. That means showing the public that you understand why what you did was wrong, not just giving them a half-hearted apology. You need to be a part of the reform. You have to show that you want to be better, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been hurt by what happened. John's heart raced. He wasn't sure he had it in him, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that James was right. If he really wanted to make this right, he needed to do more than just apologize. He had to be willing to confront the bigger issue, the systemic racism and abuse of power within the police force. It was going to be a hard road, but maybe this was a moment where he could change something. The following days were filled with meetings. John had to meet with his superiors, answer questions, and face the consequences of his actions. Each conversation felt like a personal attack. His colleagues looked at him with a mix of pity and disdain, some outright avoiding him. It was clear that the trust they once had in him had been shattered, and there was no easy way to rebuild it. The worst part was the growing pressure to make a public statement. The department was under investigation, and every move John made was being watched. No matter what he did, it felt like it wasn't enough. He was being forced to confront not just the fallout from his mistake, but the deep-seated issues within law enforcement itself. One afternoon, as John sat at his desk, he received a call. It was from a reporter, someone who had been covering the case since the beginning. Mr. Miller, the reporter's voice was sharp. I'm calling to ask if you have any comments about the investigation. There's been a lot of talk about what you plan to do next. People want to know if you'll be taking responsibility for the bigger issue here, not just the personal mistake you made. John swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. I don't have a comment at this time, he replied. The reporter didn't let up. Are you planning to take any further action? People want to know if you'll stand up for the changes that need to happen in your department. John hesitated. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but he didn't know if he was ready to say them out loud yet. It felt like an admission of something bigger than he was prepared for. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm. I made a mistake. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But I also realize now that the problem goes deeper than me. It's bigger than just what happened that day. And I will do everything in my power to make sure it never happens again. I will work to change the system from within. The reporter paused, as if unsure of how to react. We'll see what happens, Mr. Miller. People are watching you. John ended the call, feeling the weight of those words press on him. He had said what he needed to say, but was it enough? That evening, as John sat alone, reflecting on everything that had happened, his phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a text from his wife, Lisa. We're with you, John. I know it's hard, but you're not alone in this. Let's face it together." He smiled faintly. At least he had her. She was the one person who hadn't turned away from him, who still believed he could change. Maybe that was enough to start with. John took a deep breath, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose. He wasn't going to let this be the end of him. It was time to begin the hard work of redemption. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. John Miller was constantly in meetings, trying to salvage his reputation and figure out the next step in a situation that seemed to be spiraling further out of control. The media was relentless, and the public outcry grew louder with each passing hour. Protesters had taken to the streets, calling for justice not only for the elderly man he had wronged, but for the countless other victims of police brutality. The narrative was no longer just about one mistake. It had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with law enforcement. John sat in a conference room, his hands resting on the table in front of him, nervously tapping the surface. His commanding officer, Sergeant Harris, was sitting across from him, a stern expression on his face. The air between them was thick with tension. "John, this situation has become more than just a personal screw-up. The department is under fire. Your actions have triggered investigations, protests, and public outrage. The last thing we need is for this to blow up even more," Sergeant Harris said, his voice low but firm. "I know," John replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Harris leaned forward, his gaze intense. "This wasn't just a mistake, John. This was an abuse of power. You humiliated a man in front of an entire store. You accused him of something he didn't do. And worse, he turned out to be the head of the FBI. You've put all of us in a position where we have to answer for your actions." John's stomach twisted. He knew the gravity of the situation, but hearing it laid out in such stark terms made it feel all the more real. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Harris sighed, shaking his head. "The only thing you can do is own up to your actions. You need to take full responsibility and apologize. The public needs to hear from you, and they need to know you understand the gravity of what happened. But don't think for a second that this will be easy. People won't forget what you did, especially after what came out about Thompson. The department might never recover from this." John nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he could do to fix things, but one thing was clear. He was going to have to face the consequences, whether he liked it or not. That afternoon, John sat at his desk in the small, cluttered office at the precinct, staring at the computer screen. He had been asked to write a statement, an official apology that would go out to the public. It seemed simple enough in theory, but the words felt hollow. How could he possibly apologize for something so deeply wrong? Could any words really undo the damage he'd caused? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he called, his voice sounding more exhausted than he intended. The door opened, and Detective Sarah Walker stepped inside. She was one of the few colleagues who hadn't completely turned her back on him. Her expression was neutral, but John could tell she wasn't here for small talk. "John," she said quietly, walking over to his desk. "I've been reading through the reports, and I wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" John leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I feel like I'm sinking, Sarah." She nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I get it. I really do. But here's the thing. The media is going to keep coming at you. People are going to keep questioning you. You can't just hide from this. If you want to keep your job, if you want any chance of redeeming yourself, you have to stand up. You have to be real." John looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "And how do I do that? How do I make it right?" "You start by being honest," she said firmly. "Tell the truth. Apologize. Show the public you're not just some robot following orders. Show them that you understand the problem goes beyond you, that you see the bigger picture now. If you do that, you might just make it through this. But if you keep trying to sweep it under the rug, you're done." John sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the words. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this." "You don't have a choice," Sarah replied softly. "The only way out of this mess is through it." Later that evening, after hours of drafting and redrafting the statement, John finally hit send. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. He had said the words he knew needed to be said. Now, it was in the hands of the public. The phone rang almost immediately. "John, it's Lisa." He sat up straighter, her voice a comforting presence even through the phone. "Hey, babe. What's up? Did you send it?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "Yeah," he replied, his voice quiet. "I did. It's done. Good. You did the right thing," she said. "Now, you just have to keep going. One step at a time." John smiled faintly. "I'll try." "Take care of yourself," she added. "I'm here. We're in this together." After hanging up, John sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. He wasn't sure if this was the end of his story or just the beginning of something much harder. But at least for the first time in a long while, he had taken a step toward trying to make it right. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. He was no longer running from it. The fallout from the incident at the luxury store had shaken John Miller to his core. Weeks had passed, and while the public's fury hadn't completely dissipated, it had begun to shift. What had once been an unforgiving storm was now a dull roar, and in the aftermath, John was left to rebuild, not just his career, but his sense of self. John sat at his desk at the precinct, looking out of the small window that overlooked the busy streets of the city. The noise of the city outside felt distant, almost surreal. His mind was still racing with everything that had happened. He'd never expected his life to take such an unexpected turn, and yet, here he was. His past mistakes were laid bare for everyone to see, and now he had to face them. The office was quieter than usual. It was early in the morning, and only a few officers were milling about. John hadn't received any more hateful emails, and the phone calls from his superiors had become less frequent. It seemed as though the firestorm was dying down, at least for now. He had spent the past few weeks trying to process everything that had transpired. The media coverage, the public backlash, and the sheer humiliation of it all had left him questioning himself. But he had learned something in the process. He couldn't change what had happened. What mattered now was what he did next. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," John said, straightening up in his chair. The door opened and Detective Sarah Walker stepped in. She had been one of the few colleagues who had supported him during the hardest moments, and seeing her now brought a strange sense of comfort. She was dressed casually today, her badge tucked into her jeans. "John," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I wanted to talk." "You good?" John gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just thinking." "About what?" Sarah asked, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from him. John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "About everything. About how I messed up. About how I have to figure out what comes next. He paused. I've been thinking a lot about how I can make things right, how I can rebuild the trust I've lost. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but understanding. Well, you can start by doing what you've been doing, facing it head on. You're not the first cop to make a mistake, and you won't be the last. The key is what you do now. People aren't just going to forget, but they'll respect the effort if you show them you're committed to changing. John nodded slowly. It wasn't the first time Sarah had given him advice like this. She had always been blunt, but in the most supportive way possible. I just don't know if I can ever undo what I did, he said, his voice full of doubt. The way I treated Samuel Thompson, that was unforgivable. I humiliated him in front of everyone. He could have had me fired, thrown me in jail, but instead, he showed me mercy. You can't change what you did, but you can make sure it doesn't happen again, Sarah said firmly. And you're already starting to do that. You took responsibility. You issued an apology. You've kept your head down and worked to make amends. People are watching, John. You might not get a second chance to prove yourself, but if you do it right, you can rebuild your reputation. John looked down at his hands. They were still shaking, even after all this time. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are, Sarah said without hesitation. You've always been strong. Maybe this is your chance to prove it to yourself. The words hit harder than he expected. He had spent so much of his career thinking he was strong simply because he had a badge. But real strength, he was beginning to realize, wasn't about power or authority. It was about humility. It was about admitting when you were wrong and working to change. Just as John was about to respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw an email from Samuel Thompson. His heart skipped a beat. Hesitant, he opened it, unsure of what to expect. The email was short, direct, and surprisingly civil. Officer Miller, we may not agree on everything, but I want you to know that I appreciate the way you've handled the situation. I hope you use this as an opportunity to make real change, not just for yourself, but for the people you serve. Regards, Samuel Thompson, Director, FBI. John stared at the message for a long time. He couldn't believe it. Samuel Thompson, the very man he had wronged, had reached out to him, offering not just forgiveness, but encouragement. It was something he didn't deserve, and yet, here it was. Looks like you've got a shot at redemption, Sarah said quietly, watching John's reaction. This could be your moment. John exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of weight lift off his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. Maybe he had the chance to change, not just his own life, but the lives of those he had hurt along the way. He took a deep breath and looked at Sarah. I'm going to make things right. For real this time. Days turned into weeks, and John Miller's reputation slowly began to recover. The public's anger faded as his actions spoke louder than his mistakes. Samuel Thompson's email had given him the spark he needed. With Sarah's support and his own determination, John worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust he had lost, both within the force and with the community. It wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But as the months went by, John began to feel like he was finally on the right path. The road to redemption wasn't linear, and there were still days when doubt crept in, but John knew one thing for sure. He was no longer running from his past. He was facing it, and he was ready to move forward. And with that, John Miller's story began to change, one step at a time.